The land and story of the Bible.
The landscape, the land of the Bible, has been likened both to the playing board on which the game is played or the stage on which the drama takes place.
And here, according to the unfolding story of the Bible, our Creator chose one place on earth to show His desire to live among His people. Join us for a road tour of Judea, the land and story of the Bible, on this day of discovery. This is the land of the Bible. Here, according to the ancient Jewish scriptures, the God of creation chose a small piece of land to reveal the terms on which He would live among the people of the world. Here between the continents of Africa, Asia, and Europe, stretching from Lebanon in the north to Egypt in the south, the God of the Bible chose an intercontinental bridge on which to settle His people and build a temple that would be a house of prayer for all nations. An overview of Israel reveals four broad geographic regions: Galilee in the north, Samaria in the central hill country, Judea in the arid south, and Transjordan across the Jordan River Valley. The region of Judea, though not blessed with abundant natural resources, became the most blessed location because that's where the God of the Bible would choose as the center and focus of His plan to live not only among the people of Israel, but all the people of the world. Today, Mart DeHaan and Jimmy DeYoung are in Judea to explore what the Bible regards as the geographical, political, and spiritual center of the world.
You need a light or something to hit that dome.
The Dome of the Rock, which is the Temple Mount here in the city of Jerusalem.
And what's so interesting is that we're actually standing on a ridge. If we take just a few steps across the road, we're going to get an entirely different picture.
Just on the other side of the Mount of Olives.
Okay, that's a dramatic change, isn't it, of perspective?
Just across the street from where we were overlooking the old city in the Temple Mount, the new city of Jerusalem. This is the northern end of the Mount of Olives, where Mount Scopus and the Mount of Olives actually come together. You can see where the desert begins. So Jerusalem is perched right here on the edge of the desert, looking out to the east. We can see down through the Judean wilderness, all the way down to the Dead Sea.
And that's where we're going to find some sun today, we hope. In fact, I'll bet I can shed this jacket before we're done, Jim.
I'm sure you'll be able to. Yeah. It'll be warm down there.
Yeah.
20 to 30
have you got a map?
degrees. I do. Let's go over to the car and we can get it.
Where is it, inside?
Yes. We'll take just a moment here to show you the route we're going to take today in the area of Judea. Of course, to the north of Jerusalem would be Samaria. Judea here to the south, across the Jordan Valley over here to Transjordan. We've started here in Jerusalem. We've looked out towards the area of the Dead Sea, the Judean wilderness, as we drop from an elevation of about 2,800 feet down below sea level by 1,300 feet. Make our way by Jericho, and then follow the coastline of the Dead Sea, coming by Engedi, on to Masada. We'll come down to Arad at the southern end of the Dead Sea, make our way across into Beersheba, the route of the patriarchs as they would come into the land for the first time and then make their travels. Going back up towards Jerusalem, we'll come near to Hebron, a very sacred city to the Jewish people. The patriarchs are buried there in Hebron, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and then back completing our travels today into Jerusalem.
One of the things we're going to be looking at is not only the sights along the way, but how all of this helps us to tell the unfolding story of the Bible.
Here in Jerusalem and in the region of Judea, We're visiting a place that the God of the Bible made the spiritual center of the world. Here in Jerusalem's ancient temple, God chose to live among his people. And what makes this story so compelling is the way the God of the Bible linked his offer to live among us to real people, real times, and real places.
According to the book of Joshua, the tribe of Judah, one of the sons of Jacob and his ancestors, was given land that stretched from the Dead Sea to the Mediterranean Sea. If we want to look at the landscape, the living possibilities in this area, well, we can divide it into 4 sections. Along the Mediterranean Sea, a flat and very fertile coastal plain. Mostly Judah wasn't able to take it anyway, it was Philistine. From there, a rise of limestone hills that are pretty decent as well. Some nice agricultural valleys, some good grazing land. The Bible calls this the lowlands or the foothills, the Shphelah. From there, quite a steep rise into a hard limestone hill country, the heartland of the biblical kingdom of Judah. Land of summer fruit, olive trees, vineyards, almond trees, pomegranates. The small villages among the cuts of the wadis, of the cliffs and so on. Jerusalem at the top, the heartland. And east of that, the drop into the Dead Sea, the wilderness of Judah. Rainfall drops off quite precipitously, as does the landscape. The land of the shepherd, sheep and goats. It can't sustain a established village life. By the time of the New Testament, this place is called Judea. Mostly the high hill country and the wilderness to the east. The further, more fertile lands further to the west tend to be outside of the veil, the control of the Jewish religious worldview, more Gentile down toward the coast.
As we drove out of Jerusalem, we headed eastward through the Judean wilderness toward the Dead Sea. This area is significant as the location of the ancient Jericho Road, the precipitous trail between Jerusalem and the oasis of Jericho. The Jericho Road follows the course of the meandering wadi down to where it empties into the Jordan Valley. Here in the Jordan Valley, the city of Jericho spreads out at the base of the mountains. According to the Bible, Jericho, one of the oldest cities in the world, was the first city to fall when Joshua led the nation of Israel into the Promised Land. By the miraculous way in which the walls of Jericho collapsed, the book of Joshua describes how God displayed his presence among the people of Israel. We continue our journey south along the Dead Sea to an area of cliffs and caves that for centuries concealed a treasure of ancient scrolls.
So that's the cave right up there, huh? There's one of a number of caves.
Well, that is where the main scrolls were found. We're here at Qumran. It was a community of religious Jews about 2,000 years ago, the Essenes. They were men who meticulously would copy the books of the Old Testament, the Dead Sea Scrolls. In 1947, in the cave behind me, a Bedouin boy who was actually looking for his goats picked up a stone, went to the cave and threw the stone in, tried to scare the goats out. But he heard a strange sound, a clunk type of sound, and it was actually a jar. He went in, opened the lid of the jar, found the scrolls, the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls, probably the greatest archaeological find for the state of Israel, and maybe for the entire world as well.
What makes the scrolls so significant as an archaeological find is that archaeologists are always looking for, well, they look for pottery, for metal, for many physical objects, but when they can find script, when they can find words that describe events and people, that's like gold. But this was a find that was not only important to archaeologists, but also to the story of the Bible, because among the other materials that were found here related to the Essene community, they found copies of Old Testament books that predated the earliest manuscripts we had by 1,000 years.
The ancient scriptures found here tell the story of the God who chose this land to show his desire to live with and to provide for those who would trust him. From the caves of Qumran, we have a dramatic view of the Dead Sea. Not much has changed from biblical times when it was called the Salt Sea. It stretches 50 miles from north to south and 11 miles across to the shores of Jordan.
It's like ice, it's like snow, you know?
Beautiful.
Look here, it's like it's growing like flowers. Look at that. Look at that salt. But it's almost like it's live. The way it's, those fingers are flowers.
Some of the minerals that come out of the Dead Sea. They've told me that the Dead Sea is 7 to 10 times saltier than any ocean on the face of the earth. It's here in the lowest part of the earth, 1,300 feet below sea level. Now, in reference to where we started today in Jerusalem, that's 2,800 feet above sea level. So we've come almost 4,000 feet down in elevation here to the Dead Sea. It's a beautiful area. It's unique, majestic. Please hold.
I want to see if it works. Okay, I've seen pictures. I want to see if they're set up.
Hold the map up. We can't
I want to
afford.
just make sure I got everything out here.
I've got it all.
Okay.
In fact, I may leave and let you stay down here at the Dead Sea.
Hey.
Is it nice?
Hey, come on in. Come on.
No, sir.
Come on. Come on.
No, sir.
Hey.
Look at that. Oh, look.
Okay, where are we going next, Jim?
Over to Engedi.
All right.
You want to float down? I'll meet you there with
Let me see if I can get us on the map. All right. It works.
That's great.
Let's see. Is there any way I can get more relaxed?
I don't believe
I
so.
feel like a ball, like a,
If I could bring you a Coke or an iced tea or something, that might be nice.
The Dead Sea is such a dramatic example of landlocked water that stops flowing. It's like a huge object lesson of what happens to us when we take and take without giving. Such an appropriate picture of a land chosen by God to show his desire to live among us for the sake of others, and what happens when we, like the Dead Sea, only take and take for ourselves. When considered in light of the Bible, even the land itself tells us something about God and about ourselves. After floating in buoyant waters 7 to 10 times saltier than other oceans, Jimmy and I then headed for the oasis of Engedi, where I could wash off the salt and change into some dry clothes.
Cute. Hey, you don't look bad either. Dressed a bit different than you were a few moments ago.
The sun is hot. Dries close quickly.
Yes, indeed. Quite a contrast here from the shores of the Dead Sea down below us, coming up the slopes of the Judean wilderness here to Engedi. Engedi, the spring of the mountain goat. In fact, the word Gedi in Hebrew means the baby mountain goat, the ibex. This is the location where David would have run from King Saul, hiding in the caves, and in fact, having a confrontation with the king himself.
David did not think of a distant and far-removed God. While being chased by a jealous king, or while fighting the enemies of Israel, he expressed confidence in a near God who could provide for him in the presence of his enemies. From the barren, rocky regions of Judea, David journaled prayers and songs that showed his experience with a God who was like a shepherd, a shield, and a hiding place.
From the end of the earth I will cry to you when my heart is overwhelmed. Lead me to the rock that is higher than I. For you have been a shelter for me, a strong tower from the enemy. I will abide in your tabernacle forever. I will trust in the shelter of your wings. Psalm 61.
Driving south from Engedi, we find a well-known landmark linked historically to Herod the Great. Herod is the king who, upon hearing that the long-awaited Messiah and king of the Jewish people was born in Bethlehem, tried to kill him. He's also the king who fortified an impressive natural rock fortress on the edge of the Judean wilderness to protect himself from his enemies.
Here along the Dead Sea coast, jetting out of the Judean wilderness, is Masada, which literally means from the Hebrew, stronghold or fortress. It was Herod the Great's winter palace, an impregnable fortress, so he could come here protecting himself from his perceived enemies.
From the top of Masada, I'm moved not only by the view and by the scale of this fortress palace, but by the thought that when Herod rejected the God of this land, he rejected the God who wanted to live with him, and as a result died diseased and alone.
In 70 AD, the Romans burned Jerusalem to the ground, destroyed the temple, dispersed the Jews to the four corners of the earth, except for several who came here to Masada. In 73 AD, after a 2-month siege, the Romans defeated the Jewish community here at Masada.
After leaving Herod's impressive monument of self-protection, we drove south to the end of the Dead Sea. From there, we take the fork in the road that climbs up into the west, toward an area known from biblical times as the Negev.
Then we have to climb, rather rugged climb, up to an area that the Bible calls the Negev, the Southland, a dry basin of powdery soil, not enough rainfall for decent agriculture, sustained agriculture year to year, a land of the sheep and goats, desert land, an Abraham land, today a Bedouin land. But the middle of that Negev area, the southern end of the patriarchal highway, the watershed ridge, is Beersheba. This is the one that marks the southern border of the kingdom from Dan to Beersheba. You know, the line, the borders of the biblical kingdom from Dan to Beersheba.
Hey, Abner.
How you doing, buddy?
Hey, welcome to
Good to see
Beersheba.
you,
It's so good to see you.
Thank you.
It's good to be in your neighborhood.
Oh, this is Abraham's neck of the woods.
Wow, historic place, huh?
And we read a lot about the well. Yeah. Is this the actual site of the well?
This is Abraham's well. This is where he used to get his morning coffee, right over here.
Get all the conversation of the townsfolk too, right?
Do you mean this well?
This well right over here.
You're kidding.
This is where Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob lived, where Esau, Ishmael. It was about 20, 30 feet down from here. These stones have been laid on here just recently.
Okay.
But the well, which is over 100 meters deep, is right below us here.
And this would be the well.
I don't think I've ever been here. Lived in Israel, traveled all over. I don't think I've ever been to this well.
Yeah.
The famous well.
Yes, it is. When people talk about redigging the wells and getting to the root of things, this is where it all began. This is the first piece of land in the world that ever belonged to the Jewish people, right over here.
And why do you say that? Why?
Well, that was where Abraham then made this deal, this agreement, this oath with Abimelech. And in exchange for those lambs, they took an oath. And that's what the name of the town is, Beersheba, the well of the seven, or the well of the oath, right over here.
Beersheba, a place in Abraham's day, not a town yet, a watering hole for the sheep and goats, up and down the wadis. It became an urban center, first in the time of the United Kingdom, became an important urban center throughout the time of the monarchy. Walled, fortified, administrative, military, economic, the ideal city, one could say, both in terms of architectural remains and in terms of what the city needed to do on every level of society to hold the southern border of the kingdom.
Beersheba is the city of covenant. It's the place where God spoke to Abraham and promised him that his seed, his descendants, would become a blessing to the entire world. And little did Abraham know, when God spoke to him under the stars out here in the plain of Beersheba, that one day one of his descendants, through David, would be born in a city also beginning with B, in Bethlehem, barely 30 miles north of here, and that this descendant, Yeshua, or Jesus in English, would be the promise of blessing given here in the city of covenant, in the city of oath, that would bring light and salvation not only to the Jewish people, but to the whole world.
Avner, we're going to make our way back to Jerusalem by way of how the patriarchs would have traveled through Hebron, Bethlehem, and then into Jerusalem. Talk to us about Hebron. That was a key city, a key location as far as the history of the Jewish people,
Yes,
wasn't
it was. Hebron in Hebrew goes back to the connection between four brothers, Amorite brothers who used to live there. And Abraham knew them, people with names like Aner and Eshcol and Mamre. And he had a military treaty with them too. And they helped him when Lot was captured. So that was another one of Abraham's bases in this area. Later, of course, that was the city where King David was first crowned as king of Israel.
The natural capital, the best resourced area of Judah in the hill country is Hebron. It's about halfway between Jerusalem and Beersheba. The elevation is a bit higher, pushing 1,000 meters. The elevation is around 3,000 feet or so, plus minus. A nice wide plateau, good agriculture, good water supplies. Always has been the population base, the center of population. If one wants to establish a kingdom in the southern hill country, this is where you go to be crowned king. David did this and was king there for 7 years before he moved the kingdom, the capital rather, north to Jerusalem to try to unite the northern and southern tribes.
The ancient city of Hebron is another important link to the God who used the region of Judea to show the whole world his desire to live among his people. In more peaceful times, we visited Hebron, where David first ruled as king and where Abraham had earlier purchased a cave as a family burial site. Buried in Hebron with Abraham are Sarah, Isaac, Rebekah, and Jacob. This time, as the sun was setting, we bypassed Hebron and traveled north past the Judean village of Bethlehem, where according to both Old and New Testaments, the long-awaited Messiah and Son of God, one known as God among us, was born into the human family. It was dark when we returned to Jerusalem.
There's no better place to talk about God's desire to live among his people than right here at the Western Wall.
The ancient Jewish prophets talk about this particular location, the Temple Mount behind me, where the Messiah will come and build a temple. The psalmists in Psalm 132, verses 13 and 14, said that God had chosen Jerusalem, Zion, to dwell among his people forever. That's the story that we've been looking at today as we've traveled.
And in a sense, we're standing now on ground zero, the center of Jerusalem in some ways, the center of Judea, at least in terms of the spiritual meaning of this place. It's the big story of the Bible. It begins in Genesis, God walking with two people, God among those whom he's created. And then the whole story of the Bible about the patriarchs, the men and women who learned to walk with God, who had made promises, who took time to test his people's faith. And then when you come to the Second Testament, to the New Testament, you find the fulfillment of predictions. A Messiah comes. He walks among his people. He speaks not only as a prophet, but as God among his people. The events of his life, his death, his resurrection are all about God's desire to reconcile himself with people who have wandered away. And now he calls them back to himself. But this time, not just to one nation, but to people of the nations of the world. And so the promise to Abraham is fulfilled. God's desire to call a people for the good of everyone. And now through this new group, this international body, the New Testament talks about a God who lives in his people, among his people, through his people. God dwelling among his people and looking, as you indicated, Jim, ultimately to the fulfillment and the restoration of all things, where God lives finally, forever, among his people, and right here from this location.
The Apostle John was given a vision of this time in the future. He wrote, "I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, 'Now the dwelling of God is with men, and he will live with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them, and be their God.'"